One file type that you will need to understand working with dbt is YAML. So let's have a crash course in just a few minutes on all of the different things you need to know about YAML. It's not going to be thorough, but it'll hopefully get you introduced if you're not familiar with it. All right, so at the top, YAML can be spelled Y-A-M-L or YML. Typically, you'll see one or the other, but those are the extension file types. It stands for YAML Ain't Markup Language. Three key points about this is essentially it's just a bunch of keys and values. It's kind of like JSON or XML. It's very similar for configuration files. It's all about spacing and indentation. Technically, you don't use the tab, but everything is spaced, as you'll see. And in general, it's usually easier to read than something like JSON or XML because of the spacing, and there's not a lot of special characters that you need to worry about. So let's go through the main file types that you'll see. Again, this is going to be fairly quick, so feel free to come back and refer to this if you're confused later. So again, keys and values. This is a typical string, just a simple string, name, Mike. You put it on the same line. You can either put it just like that, or you can wrap it in text. Either one of these is acceptable, but you don't need it. So key, value as a string. Another one, year, integer. So an integer, you just write it out and you can see it recognizes it. It's smart enough to know that it's not a string based on the characters. And you can do the same for floating values, and you could put decimals in here and that would be just fine. Next, let's talk about longer strings. A lot of times this would come into play with a description potentially. So we have about one. I love talking about data. This training is incredible. Thanks. This is essentially the same as this. It's just one string. But what gets interesting is when you have really long ones. So if it's a description, I mean, it could get really, really long and take multiple lines. There's two ways you can handle this in YAML to keep it clean. One is using the greater than sign. And by doing that, and what you'll do is you'll add this here, put this on the next line. So press enter and then space in 2 times. So everything is spaced. The spacing is really important. And you'll see if you don't do that, it's going to call it out. So 2 spaces. And by putting it on 2 lines, what this one will do, which is different than this as we'll talk, this one is going to take every new line and treat it as a white space. So it will render it ultimately like this. So it'll match what this looks like, as opposed to maintaining the line breaks. Whereas this, if you use the pipe and put it on multiple lines, it's going to treat the new lines as new lines and it would render it this way. Common examples here are going to be descriptions. Maybe you want it to format a certain way, or commands as well. If you have a really long command that needs to be run all together, but you want to make it easier to read, you could use this, put it on multiple lines, and then when it renders and runs, it's going to put it all back in one line and it'll essentially treat it as one long command. Whereas this, multiple lines of different commands would be as if you ran one command, then the next command, then the other. It would treat it that way. Next is a list. So let's say hobbies. A list can be done in 2 ways. Dashes are a way to represent a list, a pretty clean way. The other option is to put them in brackets like this. Both this and this are treated the same in YAML. They're treated as lists. And the last common one you'll see is a dictionary. And the dictionary will look kind of similar to the list, but essentially it's just another layer of a key and value as opposed to the dash. So my dev team, let's say manager, name, key, value, built together like this. It's an object. It's a single object treated together, or a dictionary, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to a list. And the last thing we'll point out here is comments. Obviously we have it down here and up here. Comments in YAML are made using the hash or the pound symbol, and that'll comment it out for you. So quick intro or overview of YAML if you're not familiar with it. It's very simple and intuitive once you get used to it, and it's surprisingly really powerful for the types of configurations that you can do.